Republican strategists are telling me, did you think that Trump was kidding? I mean, did you think that Secretary of State Rubio was kidding when he, puts out that cable and says we are going to reorient the entire thing?
Welcome to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM for Tuesday, February 4th. I'm Andrew Waldworth, and I'm joined by RCP President and co-founder Tom Bevan and White House Correspondent Phil Wegmann. So, gentlemen, let's start with Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s nomination, which made it out of committee today by a party vote of 14-13. This sends it to the Senate floor, which is expected to vote next week. So, Phil, RFK was anticipated to be one of the tougher names to get across the finish line, but it looks like his chances are pretty good right now. What do you make of the vote?
So RFK advances on a party line vote. The big sort of nugget there is that Senator Bill Cassidy voted for him despite some of his concerns about RFK Jr. Cassidy, of course, is not only a physician himself, but he's one of these Republicans who doesn't care if he balks the party line. Roll back to Obamacare when Cassidy was very much a speed bump for what Republicans wanted to do during repeal and replace. Now, eventually he got there, but during the early days, he was telling his conference to slow down. I think what we're seeing here is RFK Jr., he got out of committee. It was going to be contentious, but Republicans got on board. And that's due in large part to the lobbying of Vice President J.D. Vance. His argument to these Republicans has been, you don't have to agree with him on everything, but if you agree on the majority of things, then don't you think that the president ought to have the cabinet that the president wants? And that's the argument that seems to have won the day. One of the things, though, that is particularly interesting is as RFK Jr. is advancing out of committee. We had seen some fireworks over the question of vaccines and autism. What does Donald Trump do but go on his social media website, True Social, and shine a giant spotlight on what he sees as the fact that there are more cases of autism than there were previously. So it remains a live wire. We'll see if, there are any other Republican defections before the end, but this is a good sign. That said, my sources in the White House, they are not counting their chickens before they hatch.
So, Cassidy was sort of the most interesting vote here. Phil points out he's a physician himself. He's been he was a practicing physician for 20 years. And he voted for Trump's impeachment, of course, last time around. So he's not a big MAGA guy. But Tom, was it just overwhelmed? Was he just overwhelmed by the politics of the moment? Or the other thing is Kennedy, was Kennedy able to convince him? They apparently spoke several times over the weekend that he would be, and this was Cassidy's quote, a partner as well as a secretary.
I think Kennedy did convince him. And a lot of this comes down to these private meetings that the nominees have with the senators, where the senators get to talk about whatever their particular focus or pet issue is and get reassurances. We saw that with Pete Hegseth and women in the military. We've seen that with some other nominees as well. And I think Kennedy basically closed the deal. He closed the sale. I also think, and we talked about this before, that Tulsi, Gabbard, and Kennedy being the two most vulnerable nominees. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has a big movement. This MAGA movement is no joke. I mean, there are millions and millions of moms and folks around the country who are passionately believe, in his priorities of making America healthy again, and really sort of trying to, make our food supply much healthier. And I think that also came to bear on this whole nominating process as well.
Phil, the sort of abortion thing didn't factor as big in these hearings as a lot of people had thought, at least on the Republican side. And he was pretty combative in these hearings, especially with the Democrats. And was that just part of the strategy that he just knew he had to get every Republican vote and he could forego every Democratic vote? And it all came down to that, really down to Bill Cassidy, I guess.
He went to war with Democrats, and then he assured Republicans that Donald Trump is still the biggest bully in the room. If you look at the abortion question, one of the things that Democrats were tearing their hair out constantly over was the fact that RFK Jr. really flipped on a number of these positions. They were saying, look, just 6 months ago when you were running for president, you yourself, said that women have a fundamental right to choose. What changed? And again, what we saw from RFK Jr. is he said, I will be the president's secretary and I will put into place his agenda. And so I think that that was a way for him to neutralize that issue on the right. And it shows that going into this thing, I think the strategy was not to win over Democrats, but to mollify some of these Republicans. What I'm most curious about, if he does get confirmed, is does this MAHA movement, which definitely has legs, it's got energy, especially after the pandemic when trust in institutions is low, does that play nice with the other cabinet secretaries? There was an uproar in certain corners of the internet over Brooke Rollins, Trump's agriculture secretary, promising to reverse this California pork law, which would allow the sale of pork that had been raised and bred in a cage. That's anathema to everything about what RFK Jr. wants with new food and safety regulations. So it's always going to be a tenuous piece. That's sort of my point here. It's always going to be a tenuous piece if he gets confirmed, and it will be up to Donald Trump to sort of keep him in line, at least in the minds of some of these more socially conservative Republicans.
Well, Tom, the politics of this for Cassidy are interesting too, because he's going to have a challenge. He's up for election in 2 years, and I'm just wondering whether that's really the lens through which we should view all this. That at the end of the day, these confirmation hearings, every senator is looking over his or her shoulder saying, are they going to come after me if I vote against this guy? And at the end of the day, so far, it looks like they all say, you know what? I guess I can go along with this person because alternatively, I may lose my job.
Obviously, politics plays a role in all of this, and politicians are all about personal preservation, and they do, I think, most things with an eye toward, will this help me win re-election or not? So I'm sure that factored in, and look, I mean, there is.
I think in Louisiana it must factor in quite a bit. That I guess my question.
Yeah, no, look, I'm sure that's part of it. It is a deep red state, and I'm sure he would get a robust primary challenge in that state from a MAGA conservative, and all it would take really would be Donald Trump endorsing that person. Doesn't matter who they are, really, to make them a full-blown legitimate contender. And so I'm sure that factored into this as well.
Yeah. Well, Phil, we're going to have to take a break right now. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Phil and Tom. Don't go away. We'll be back after this. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom Bevan and Phil Wegmann. And Tom, we had these protests outside the office of the Agency for International Development. They were demonstrating against President Trump's decision to defund USAID. The protests come after Elon Musk sent out resignation letters to about 2 million federal employees and shuttered the AID building. Democratic lawmakers argue that Trump's actions are unconstitutional. Democratic House Leader Hakeem Jeffries said he will, quote, choke off Trump's efforts using the next budget bill as his cudgel. What do you make of the Democrats' response? And can they really do anything at all about these efforts by DOGE?
Well, Brian Schatz, the senator from Hawaii, put a blanket hold on all of the Trump's nominees for Secretary of State. So yeah, they have some levers they can pull. But I mean, more broadly, the question is this really the issue they're going to go to the mats on? Like unfettered government spending. You're not allowed to look at the books. You're not allowed to audit the books. And yeah, it's fine that we're sending, millions of dollars around the globe to fund all of these transgender operas and comic books and all this stuff that they uncovered. I mean, if the Democrats need to reconnect with working class voters, if that's really the main issue, I think they're going to be I don't think this is the answer. This is not the silver bullet for them, because as someone pointed out on Twitter the other day, I mean, the folks in Western North Carolina who continue to suffer are looking at this stuff, and folks in across the country, working class folks are looking at this and saying, are you really sending, even if it's only 250,000, which is a pittance compared to the trillions that we're talking about government, but to a working class person, to most people, that's real money. I mean, that's a year or 2 or 3 of salary for most people, and they're sending that to other countries to fund LGBTQ drag shows or whatever they're doing. I mean, that's insanity. And so I think this might end up being a political loser for them if that's what this ends up, how this gets framed. If it gets framed the way the Democrats want it, which is, well, we're engaging with the world and we're saving lives around the world, and then it might be a little bit tougher for Republicans. But right now, to me, it seems like Elon Musk and DOGE and Trump and Marco Rubio are on the offensive, and they are making a very persuasive case of that the government has just been out of control, spending all this money, and they won't even let us look at the books. That is not, most people are going to be like, that's insane.
Yeah. Well, Phil, I don't know. AID wasn't on my bingo card for Doge, but it certainly is sort of front and center right now. And, to Tom's point, the criticism is, oh, this is only 0.4% of the federal budget or something. Like, I was sort of shocked that it was that high. I mean, it's a measurable part of the federal budget. So, and other people say it's closer to 1%. That is, given the size and scope of the federal budget, a lot of money. And do you think the Democrats are wise to sort of pick this as the hill they want to die on, or do you think it's just of the moment?
Well, we know that nothing drives turnout like U.S. aid grants to non-government organizations popularized by people who live on the coasts. I think the best argument that Democrats have when it comes to USAID is that without it, the United States will lose an arrow in the quiver to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. Secretary of State Rubio was asked about that criticism, and his response was essentially that these particular egregious examples weren't going to win over friends anywhere. Instead, this was an opportunity for the United States to enforce a progressive politics on nations that don't want them. And so throughout all of this, whether it's USAID or the other actions of Donald Trump, Republican strategists are telling me, did you think that Trump was kidding? I mean, did you think that Secretary of State Rubio was kidding when he, puts out that cable and says we are going to reorient the entire thing towards what is in America's best interest? And so, in this case, I think that this is kind of the dress rehearsal for some of the larger lifts, some of the more aggressive changes that Donald Trump and Elon Musk want. There are all sorts of statutory questions here, whether or not this is constitutional. I won't pretend to be a lawyer, but I think that this very well could be sort of the appetizer for things to come, when they seek more reforms. And look, Elon Musk has even said this on Twitter. He was looking for a small example, something to sink his teeth in to begin with. And USAID, according to Rubio and others, they were not being cooperative during the transition, and so they, might have signed their own fate.
Yeah, Tom, the interesting thing about USAID, to Phil's point, is that these are a lot of the employees, in air quotes, are contractors. So they don't have the kind of union protection that other federal workers have. So it is sort of, in that way, maybe low-hanging fruit, or a little bit easier to stop these sort of grants. That's the way most of the funding goes out. I guess it's grants to these NGOs. But that, again, attenuates the line of authority and command, so there's less and less control by who's ever running USAID over how that money is spent. And that's why Marco Rubio has said when he was a senator, he couldn't get good reporting from USAID. So a lot of the functions that USAID does that are positive, I presume, could be shifted under Marco Rubio's control of the State Department and continue. We could still send food overseas. We could do vaccine programs, all this sort of stuff. But eliminate some of the more egregious or politically correct stuff that they've identified.
Well, that's exactly what Rubio said when he was asked about this. Is that this organization was started by Congress and was supposed to be under the purview of the State Department, became basically like a global charity that just operated independently, and as if they were, this money was privately granted to them. No, this is U.S. taxpayer dollars. It is supposed to be a part of the State Department. And to Marco Rubio's his point, some of that stuff is aligned with our national security interests and our national interests around the globe, and we should continue those programs. But as Phil pointed out earlier, some of these things that this group is doing is undermining and at odds with, and making it harder for the State Department to actually work with these governments, because they don't want these programs, or they're not, they're not aligned with U.S. interests. And so, and then to make it all worse, when Congress tried to get some oversight, even when the new administration comes in and says, hey, we want to, let us take a look at what's going on in there. And they're basically like, no, like, we don't answer to you. We don't answer to anybody. I mean, that kind of attitude, to Phil's point, didn't win them any friends. And certainly, I think, made it easier for the administration to take dramatic action. But the idea that the Democrats, the way that they responded to this, I mean, I know they're kind of flailing around and looking for something to unify them and rally them to the cause, but the way that they reacted to this was so over the top and crazy. It makes you want, again, it's only 1% of the federal budget, or whatever the actual number is. Maybe it's less than 1%, still real dollars, but I mean, just imagine what they're going to do when Trump starts getting after bigger parts of the federal government, because that's coming. It's coming, I think, probably sooner than most people think.
Yeah, I will. Phil, Tom anticipated my question to you, which is that you said they wanted to start small. Department of Education, not so small. Is that next on the chopping block, or is that going to survive?
The theme of this season of Donald Trump is that some of the big promises may actually come true. Elon Musk certainly takes Donald Trump both seriously and literally. And when it comes to the Department of Education, it looks like they're ready to go whole hog and get rid of it. I'm not certain if they'll be able to do this, because so many states really have become intertwined with the Department of Education for their own K through 12 systems. It is one thing to defund a hippie NGO program that puts on plays across the world. It's another thing when, this is a department that affects everybody's kids. And so that will be more difficult. And perhaps sort of Elon Musk's hard charging nature might not prove as much of an asset at the Department of Education, which Republicans and Democrats both agree does do some good things, even as you have more conservative Republicans who have been advocating since Ronald Reagan for it to be eliminated. Also, just a quick programming note: can we acknowledge that there's a lot of Project 2025 that the current administration is running with, and some of the disavowals from the Trump campaign, they were not worth the paper that they were printed on.
Well,
Getting rid of the
Tom,
Department of Education was front and center for those folks.
Although to be fair to that, Phil, I think the Heritage Foundation has advocated for the end of the Department of Education ever since I came to Washington in the 80s. I think this has been going on for a long time. But Tom, they may actually try to get it done this time.
They may. I'll believe it when I see it, because to Phil's point, I mean, it would be tough to fully eliminate it. But if they cut it in half, if they're able to cut it by, a third or 2/3 or something, it will be an impressive feat. But to your point, Andy, I mean, look, this is one of the holy grails. It reminds me of the promises that every president made, not just Republican, but also Democrat, to move the embassy to Jerusalem, right? 40 years, 50 years, everybody said it. Well, this is the same sort of thing, but only for Republicans. You remember Rick Perry and his oops moment. He was trying to remember the
Right.
departments that he was going to eliminate, and education was one of them, along with, I think, energy, which he ended up running, and a couple others. But yeah, I mean, Republicans have talked about eliminating the Department of Education for decades. And so, if Donald Trump is able to get it done, that would be something. I think it's going to be hard, very hard, given the influence that the teachers unions have in this country. And again, I just mentioned, I mean, if you thought the Democrats lost their minds out in front of the USAID building the other day, just wait till they're protesting out in front of the Department of Education. I mean, they will absolutely go ballistic over this if that's what if the reports that Trump is trying to do this, if those are true.
Yeah, well, I think it's true that he's trying to do it, or he's certainly thinking about doing it, and we'll see if he actually tries to get it done. Anyway, interesting day in Washington. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Phil Wegmann and Tom Bevan, but don't go away. We'll be back right after this.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Philip Wegmann, White House reporter for RCP, and I'm joined now by Connecticut Representative Jim Himes. He is the ranking member on the House Intelligence Committee, and we're very lucky to have him today. Congressman, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I won't sugarcoat it, Congressman. After losing the Senate and the White House, and at a moment when 60% of the country views your party unfavorably, according to a recent Wall Street Journal poll, Democrats are on the back foot. And yet you sort of sent out a hold fast signal to your party the other day when you warned on Twitter that Trump is at his maximum political power now, implying that at some point in the coming months or years that power would wane. So what should the Democratic playbook be for the next 4 years? And is it enough to rerun the sort of resistance playbook from the first Trump term, or is an update needed?
Yeah, no, it's not enough to run the same resistance playbook, and I don't think that we could if we wanted to. I mean, there have been lots of observers who have observed that the opposition to Donald Trump is, a lot less energized than it was in Trump 1, and there's a whole bunch of reasons for that, including the fact that he won the popular vote. And there's a lot of reflection going on inside my party about the fact that we offered a candidate who was vice president of the United States, strong legislative record, yes, damaged by inflation the way candidates all over the world were damaged by, but, civil, etc. And they chose the other guy. They chose a guy who uses the language that Donald Trump does, threatens to destroy things, threatens to prosecute his political enemies. And look, the American people chose that. And that means we need to be very, very thoughtful about sentiment, right? And there's a couple things to say in that regard. Number one, as always, and we always forget this, it's the economy, stupid. We made a strategic decision to run on women's reproductive rights and the defense of democracy, both of which are absolutely essential, but it is the economy, stupid. And right now we're at risk of, because we're a little bewildered, chasing every, if I may mix my metaphor, shiny squirrel that Donald Trump throws out there. And if we're not careful, we will screw this up. Case in point, a lot of my colleagues went and raised hell outside of USAID yesterday, and what's happening inside USAID is inexcusable. A lot of people raising hell about DOGE people showing up at Treasury with computer equipment and getting access to payment systems. I promise you that your middle-class family out there really doesn't care that much about USAID and the IT procedures inside Treasury. So I know I'm going to piss some people off by saying that, but we are at risk of chasing the latest shiny squirrel, and not staying focused on the fact that everything Donald Trump is doing so far is going to raise people's energy and food prices.
So if it's the economy first, and I do want to drill down on some of the executive actions that this administration has been right out of the gate with, but if it's the economy first, I want to get your reaction to Faiz Shakir, a longtime progressive strategist who ran unsuccessfully for DNC chair last week, when he said that Democrats, quote, utilize identity to break ourselves apart. What is your reaction to that sentiment, which is becoming kind of a theme, and it seems, sort of perhaps parallel to what you just laid out a moment ago?
So I didn't see his comments, but the gist is right. The gist is right. You know, there is something in the American soul that rebels against really finely drawn identity politics. By the way, and you don't even need to go to our Constitution. Go to Martin Luther King's famous speech where he says, I look forward to the time when in this country someone is judged by the content of the character, not by the color of their skin. And we make a fetish, frankly, out of the color of one's skin, the gender identity, all of these ways of parsing people. And we do it for a good reason. And let me be very clear about this. We do it for a good reason, which is that many groups of people over the generations have been badly disenfranchised, if not to say, prejudiced and attacked by majority groups. And so we do it for all the right reasons. But again, there's something in the American soul that if you're spending all of your time talking about intersectionality and, the various fine gradations of gender preference and stuff, the American people aren't bad people. Yeah, of course, there are some bigots out there, but they see that and they say, wait a second. What about my grocery bill? What about my energy bill? What about the fact that there's no way I can afford my kids' college? So it comes back to, it's the economy, stupid. Look, we forget this, but how does Boris Johnson in the UK build the most stomping, and it feels like a million years ago, but the most stomping majority ever? How do you win? How does Bill Clinton win? How does Donald Trump win? You win by running left economically and by being centrist culturally. That means being patriotic. It means not being obsessed over identity politics. It means not getting lost in very fine debates over, what sort of puberty blocking drugs are appropriate at one point. Again, the formula is there. Left-leaning economics, centrist, maybe even slightly right-leaning cultural approaches. Boris Johnson in the UK put together, he won seats in places like Birmingham and Manchester, where the Conservative Party was very literally the party of Satan. And we just need to remember that formula. And that is how we will win in this country.
Just very quickly to put a bow on this, is your assessment that Vice President Harris lost the general election because of the economy and not some other reason, like, say, sexism?
So I think, again, remember the context here. If you look at elections around the world, it's really hard to point, and there were record numbers of elections around the world in industrialized countries. It's hard to point to a single country in which the incumbent leader's party won. People were really angry about inflation and by the hangover associated with COVID-19. It's not clear to me that Harris could have won under any circumstances. I think she actually ran a really good campaign considering the chalice that she was handed, with only whatever it was, 3.5 months to run a campaign. I think she was held to account for some of the more culturally left things that she said in 2019 and 2020. I think we were wrong-footed because we didn't realize that those attacks were happening in media that we don't go on. That this was coming up in podcasts with 7 million listeners as opposed to MSNBC with a 400,000 viewer footprint. And so, yeah, I'm not sure she could have won. You can't look around the world and say, oh, well, this incumbent would have survived. But again, we ran this campaign on women's reproductive rights and the defense of democracy, two absolutely critical things. But when America is really pissed off about inflation, they see you talking about those things and say, these folks don't get me.
So you are on House Intel, so let's pivot to national security with the time we have remaining. I want to ask you about something that will undoubtedly be a topic of conversation between President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu today at the White House. There's new reporting out of the New York Times that U.S. intelligence has concluded that Iran is looking for a shortcut that would enable them to turn their stockpile of nuclear fuel into a workable weapon, not within years, but rather in a matter of months. Is that timeline accurate?
Well, I would say that I don't think anybody out there believes that Iran is years away from getting a nuclear weapon. I can't be terribly specific about this, but I would say it is already a matter of months. If they decided to go forward with the weaponization and all the other little things you need to do around alloys and the concentration of uranium to do it, I think it's a matter of months today. It's one of the great tragedies of tearing up the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. The Iranians said, fine, we'll just go, we're going to not give inspectors the access that they had before. We're not going to have the transparency, and we're going to fire up the centrifuges again. So, and it's a fascinating moment, right? Because if you're an Iranian regime leader right now, you say to yourself, wow, the Israelis took out my air defenses. I'm completely exposed right now. I no longer have control of Syria. I can't use that. Hezbollah, Hamas, my proxies are shadows of their former selves. They're coming for us. And therefore, we should really accelerate the process of having a nuclear weapon. Because if we have a nuclear weapon, they're not coming for us. On the flip side, of course, is the risk that if they do that, some combination of Israelis and others attack. But it feels to me like a very, very scary moment right now.
The previous shorthand was that they could have a nuclear weapon within 18 months. Is it a shorter runway than that now if they shortcut some of the traditional ways of developing a nuclear weapon and try and hurry out of the gate with something perhaps less sophisticated? I know you can't talk out of school, but
Yeah, no, all I can do is not be super specific, but the answer to your question is yes. There are absolutely circumstances, if they were particularly adept at hiding some of the research that they would need to do around miniaturization, which I think, they're pretty adept people. Do we have the transparency that we had 7 years ago? Absolutely not. So no, I would, just sitting here right now, I would say that if they decided to sprint, they could have a weapon inside of 18 months, in my opinion.
so you mentioned the possibility of negotiations referring to the JCPA 2 weeks ago in the Oval Office. Donald Trump seemed to crack the door open ever so slightly to talks when he said that he hoped Iran was open to making a deal. Is there anything that you can tell us about perhaps what you're hearing behind the scenes? Do you think that any Iranian overture would be welcome in Washington, D.C.? Would it be welcome from the Israelis? We're certainly in a different scenario now than we were at the beginning of the Israel-Gaza conflict.
Yeah, I don't want to speculate on how the Israelis might think about it. I mean, Prime Minister Netanyahu, there's not much question in my mind that he's been, trying for a very long time to get the United States to join him in a military attack on Iran. The way Donald Trump thinks about it, there's sort of two interesting aspects to that. Number one, Donald Trump will consider any deal, right? I mean, the guy wrote a love letter to, Kim Jong-un and went and visited him in North Korea, right? This is a guy, and to some extent, I sort of appreciate this. This is a guy who'll try to do a deal with anybody. He sort of defines himself as the guy who can do the deal. By the way, rumors are that he would like a Nobel Peace Prize if he could somehow bring an Iran deal that would achieve some goals for national security and maybe open the place up a little bit. That would be on the table. And here's the other interesting thing. One thing, again, there's not a lot I appreciate about Donald Trump, but I do think he is allergic to the thought of a Middle Eastern war. And I think that the prospect of an attack on Iran that led to a ground war, now you've got our ships being attacked in the Persian Gulf, you've got terrorism throughout Europe, you've got American troops on the ground. I think he looks at that and says, not on my watch. And so for those two reasons, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that he might try. And look, a lot of this resides with the prime minister, right? We're looking hopefully to phase 2 of a peace deal. If the prime minister can muster the political courage, and it's going to take a lot of political courage to go through with phase 2 and phase 3 of the ceasefire agreement in Gaza, that opens the door to conversations with the Saudis. Though it is not the moment for the Israeli people, that opens the door because the Saudis will demand it to a conversation about a resolution to the Palestinian Israeli challenge, hopefully a 2-state solution. But anyway, you can see a sequence of events that if the prime minister feels he can show a great deal of political courage, might actually, lead to some good things, including the isolation of Iran.
And finally, Congressman, Secretary of State Rubio was in Panama over the weekend, where he warned the government there that they must reduce Chinese influence around the Panama Canal. And Panama announced shortly afterwards that they would not be renewing their agreement with China's Belt and Road Initiative when it expires. Is that welcome news?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, it's welcome news that we're dealing in realities now, right? Donald Trump, in his inauguration speech, lied and said that the Chinese run the Panama Canal. It's just not true. It is true that the Chinese have a presence there in ports, and yes, that's uncomfortable. And look, we'll take the wins where we can get them. Now, I sort of worry about, what we've just seen with Colombia, with Mexico, and with Canada, where we've basically just put a gun to their head vis-a-vis tariffs and said, unless you do what we want, we're gonna crush your economy. By the way, it would also crush our economy. And then they give up things that are not all that spectacular. Mexico was planning on moving troops to the border anyway. Canada has said they'll buy a helicopter and do some other stuff. I do worry, though, when alliances are more important than ever, that bullying ought to not be the first tool that we use. So, especially in Latin America, right? Latin Americans deep in their souls have a suspicion of, Yankee imperialism. So, anyway, I'm not going to say that what this administration has achieved with Panama and Venezuela and Colombia are bad things, but there is a limit to your ability to bully Latin Americans and ultimately achieve what we want to achieve with respect to drugs and migration and that sort of thing.
Congressman, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you for joining us. I'm Philip Wegmann. You've been listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. We'll be right back after the break.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief for Real Clear Politics. Talking now with Peter Berkowitz, a friend of the show and a contributor, regular columnist for Real Clear Politics. Peter doesn't write, 750-word columns he dashes off. He writes essays that he thinks about deeply. And I'm sure if you're listening to our program, I'm not sure, but I hope you're familiar with his work. Peter, thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you, Carl.
Yesterday, we talked a lot about the State Department, but I want to come back to that because you worked there. And, President Trump did all these things at the State Department. And I want to ask you a couple of questions about, first of all, just the legality of it. Can a president with a stroke of the pen get rid of an agency like USAID, which was kind of on the auspices of the State Department, was considered all but an independent agency, and it was created by a statute of Congress many years ago, I think during the Kennedy administration. Can a president just do away with it, like with a stroke of a pen?
No, the president cannot, and the president hasn't. Happily for us, Secretary of State Rubio clarified matters earlier today. It turns out that USAID has been put under the authority of Secretary of State Rubio. That is, he is now the acting director of USAID. And by statute, USAID actually does report to the Secretary of State. So what you can say is, notwithstanding the hoopla around this, what President Trump has done is streamline operations at USAID, bringing it directly under control of the Secretary of State.
Well, that sounds like, good, maybe not good government, good business, certainly. Yeah. But so is anything being lost? Was there a reason, a legitimate reason, other than bureaucratic, for that agency to have its own command structure?
There was undoubtedly a good reason for it at the beginning, but President Trump's argument, and it must be said now, Secretary of State Rubio's argument, he made this in a kind of impromptu conversation with reporters this morning, is that spending at USAID has gotten out of control. It has become highly partisan. It does not advance the interests of the United States, at least as this administration understands those interests. It had defied the Trump administration's initial efforts over the last 2 weeks to undertake some accounting of that spending. And under those circumstances, it does seem to me that the head of the executive branch and the Secretary of State are right to say, stop, let's investigate what's going on, and let's make sure the tremendous sums that are being doled out by the USAID are doled out in ways that advance U.S. interests and not merely a set of partisan interests.
So what would be an example of something that USAID was doing during the Biden administration that the Trump administration would find really didn't fit its goals, didn't fit why Trump ran? He ran as a kind of protectionist. He had a series of things. Everything America first, make America great again. When Marco Rubio first got there, he puts out this directive, things don't directly advance the interests of the United States. We have no business doing them. What would be an example that USAID might have been doing that wasn't good for the country, at least in the minds of the Trump officials?
Well, here's a bizarre example that's just come to my attention based on reporting. It turns out that USAID gave funds to the Rockefeller Foundation, which distributed funds to local NGOs, including one run by Bill Kristol, with seemingly advancing the interests of a magazine he runs called The Bulwark. That seems to me a undertaking by USAID that is not consistent with the Trump administration's understanding of America's vital national security interests.
Well, Peter, I saw that on Twitter. I guess I'm supposed to call it X. Yes, is that really true?
I don't know. I haven't checked it myself, but I am confident that one could find around the world various politicized investments that I would be surprised if one didn't find in the accounting.
Well, look, what you say is true. Our listeners should know. And The Bulwark is a publication devoted to attacking Donald Trump.
Yes.
And I certainly understand. I do not question the motives of people who find Donald Trump problematic and their right to attack him. It's a little bracing to learn that taxpayers' money was going towards that endeavor, I have to say.
Well, not only that, it's taxpayer money that is intended to support causes abroad that align with America's national security interests. In any case, I'm confident that the accounting will show that USAID funding tends overseas to support progressive causes, NGOs that may present themselves as neutral, but lean in one particular political direction, and so on. And in any case, this we do know, that the officials at the USAID were impeding the investigation that the Trump administration was undertaking. For sure, the executive branch is entitled to a serious accounting of where American money is going. If you are impeding that investigation for whatever motives, the executive branch and the head of the executive branch, the Secretary of State and the President, are entitled to remove people who are impeding that investigation and proceed with the investigation.
You're listening to Peter Berkowitz on Sirius XM Radio. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief of RealClearPolitics. Peter, I wanted to ask you, you worked at the State Department under Secretary Mike Pompeo.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what you see so far, the early stages. Pompeo and Marco Rubio seem to me to be pretty simpatico, but it's a different Trump administration this time around. He hit the ground running. He's got priorities. He's really before his Trump, when he ran in 2016, his rhetoric was different, but this time his policies seem to match the rhetoric. What do you see as the primary difference between what do you anticipate is going to be the difference in emphasis between Marco Rubio and Mike Pompeo?
Well, a superficial difference is Rubio's setting out on his first trip abroad to Central America. He, in fact, published a piece in the Wall Street Journal on Friday with the clever title "America's First," meaning we have to pay attention to our neighbors. I think that's right, but I actually think it was misleading and disguised the continuity between the Rubio State Department and the Pompeo State Department. Why do I say that? Well, if you actually read the piece, you discover that one of the reasons that Rubio wants to travel to Central America is in order to bolster American relations, in order to counter Chinese encroachments in Central America. We saw fruit of that trip also reported today that the head of Panama has agreed to terminate a deal with the Chinese for management of the canal. This is a win for Rubio. This is a win for the Trump administration, and in my judgment, a win for the United States. To complete the answer to your question, though, what this shows is that the question of the Chinese Communist Party and its conduct in all regions of the world to induce economic and diplomatic and political dependence on nation states. That was an important theme of the last 18 months of Mike Pompeo's tenure as Secretary of State. And it looks to me, I see encouraging signs that it will be a guiding theme of the Rubio State Department. And that is, I believe, as it should be.
You know, when you were in the State Department, you put out, there was a paper that came out that you had a hand in it,
Yeah.
talking about that the State Department should be extolling American values in the world, and that these values are constitutional: democracy, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, certainly. The Biden administration seems to have, sort of anything Pompeo did, Anthony Blinken didn't want to do. But why would you? What was their problem with promoting American values? What were they thinking is a better role for the State Department and for American diplomacy?
Well, in their way, they sought to promote things, but this is a guess at what repelled them from what we did. As you know, Secretary Blinken formally repudiated the report of the Commission on Inalienable Rights shortly after he entered office. There was no need for him to do this because nobody had formally adopted our report. I think it offended.
Yeah, but what about, okay, what in the report didn't he like? I read the report. I thought it was great. I didn't see how anybody, Republican, Democrat, or Independent, could object to it. What did I miss?
It seems to me obvious that neither Secretary Blinken nor the team that drafted his remarks read the report, because there's no sin of which he accused us that we were guilty. I could go through the 8 or 9 sins that he
give us 3 or 4.
Yeah, give us 3 or 4. The report doesn't recognize that liberal democracies are particularly well suited to advance the cause of human rights. We recognize that. The report does not recognize that the human rights are thought to be interlocking. You can't just pick and choose. We recognize this. The report doesn't give sufficient appreciation to pluralism in implementing rights around the world. We emphasize this. I could go on.
Okay, so you wrote a report stressing that American foreign policy should be, the one key aspect of it should be promoting human rights. And they wrote a rebuttal, said, we don't like this because it doesn't advocate promoting human rights. Short. How's it, the Twitter version?
In short, yes. In short, yes.
But the real objection was that it came out of the Trump administration.
Yeah, but there was one other objection, one other aspect of our report to which they objected. We said that America's commitment to what are indeed universal rights is deeply rooted in America's national traditions, and we should focus on America's national traditions as the reason for our commitment to these universal rights. We acknowledge that other countries, other peoples, other civilizations may go about defending universal rights their way, but we should proudly affirm that our commitment to universal rights, the rights all human beings share, are rooted in our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, our mode of government.
All right, here's a softball question then. So your report was a little too pro-American for them? Is that what you inferred?
Well, God, if you're going to insist that I give you short answers, the short answer to that question is yes.
Well, look, it's a new day, for better or worse. You've been listening to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief. I'm talking with my good friend Peter Berkowitz of the Hoover Institution, and a former State Department official and a frequent columnist for us. So be sure to be on the lookout for all of Peter's writings. And with that, I'll bid you adieu. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow, 3 o'clock in California, where I'm from, 6 p.m. here in the East. Have a good evening.